Now, before you get into this module in any detail and cover some of the theory, it might just be worth reconsidering what evaluation and return on investment is all about. Certainly this module is not about lots of happy sheets and testing and surveys after the event. It's much more to do with getting the learning experience right from the beginning. Now, one way to do that is to ask lots of good diagnostic questions before you try and go any further. So really this module, like all the modules in this series, is really about doing the diagnostics properly. Now, when you go through the slides, obviously you will cover some of the theory, but also you should be thinking immediately about the practice. So for example, one of the first things you're going to learn on the very first slide is about how evaluation is part of a system. Now, if you don't fully understand what a system means, then you need to consider that. For example, a total system would include your performance management system, your appraisal or performance review, or even personal development planning procedures. All of that should form part of a complete system. So that if a line manager sits down with one of their people and comes up with a training need, then the evaluation part of the system should kick in and say, exactly how would we measure any improvement in this particular person? And we need to get that line manager and the individual actually bought into that idea. That's what it actually means in practice. And a lot of people will not necessarily want to take training and development as seriously as that. So you will hear me saying several times about the need to get people to take it seriously. Of course, if your people don't take training and development seriously, then you have two choices really. Either you carry on providing some form of training for them when they don't really want to get too much out of it, or you say, well, unless you take it seriously, you don't get any further development. Now that's quite a harsh decision, but that's what a system really means. System should mean that you get what you plan to get. Traffic lights tend to control traffic in terms of flow and safety. And if everybody just ignored the rules of traffic lights, we'd have chaos. Now the same applies to evaluation. If everybody just wants to ignore it, then you are going to have chaos in training and development. So maybe this is the time to take the subject really seriously. Let's see how we get on. This is the evaluation and ROI module, and what we're going to cover is everything from the purpose of evaluation. We go back to the original training cycle to look at where evaluation fits in. Then we look at the baseline model. We look at one or two examples of levels 1 and 2. And we concentrate on the baseline before moving on to return on investment and seeing where the whole thing fits together in the complete learning and performance cycle. So what is the purpose of evaluation? If you thought it was about trying to justify your existence, or maybe even trying to get a bigger training budget, then maybe you need to think again. Evaluation has much more important purposes than that, and they're all very constructive and very positive. The first of these is that evaluation has to be part of a complete system. The system's purpose is to ensure employees learn what the organisation needs to know. Probably the best way to think of a system is like traffic lights, red and green. An evaluation will say some types of learning, some types of training and development programme do not fit the system, so there'll be a red light, and others will pass and they'll get a green light. So evaluation is a key part of the learning system. It's also a way of making sure that there is the highest probability that any learning intervention is going to be effective, because it goes through an evaluation check at the beginning to see whether there's a really good reason for doing it in the first place. That's why evaluation has an important part to play in design, learning design. It should happen right at the beginning, and when we get to questions like return on investment, having some understanding of what the learning might be worth in real dollar signs should influence the way we design a learning program. By doing that, evaluation itself actually adds value. When it's done before the learning intervention happens, it will help shape the whole learning process and make it quite different to any learning process where evaluation is not included from the start. Of course, it also has to close the loop. It provides feedback. It's almost another definition of evaluation, feedback. What works and what doesn't work. We need to stop doing things that don't work and do more of the things that do. and thereby it becomes a crucial part of the learning cycle, and we go round and round again, constantly trying to improve. And if we use a double loop learning cycle, then we will make sure that we're always dealing with the root causes of all the problems facing the organisation. So hopefully you can see now that evaluation serves quite a few purposes. And the last on the list, as we said before, is trying to justify your existence. Although, funnily enough, if you start to get evaluation right, the last thing you will need to bother about is justifying your existence, because it will be very clear to everybody that what you're trying to do is help the business. So be clear about your purpose before you go any further. What we don't want you to do is start creating a whole bureaucracy around evaluation. And in the worst cases, some organisations actually have dedicated teams to evaluation, when in effect what we're saying here is the only people who should be doing any evaluation are the people who are receiving the training and development themselves, and their line manager, who should be measuring the operational improvement from training and development. Now let's go back a step and look at what we call the classical training cycle. This is what established evaluation as an important subject many, many years ago, although it's always the piece that most training and development people seem to ignore, or at least feel that they're doing enough on evaluation if they do a few happy sheets and get a few tests. To start to really understand where evaluation fits in, we need to go right back to the original classical training cycle. This starts with a training needs analysis. This looks at individual training needs and tries to come up with some answers to those needs. Once you understand what the needs are, then you can design some form of learning intervention. Then you have to deliver this learning intervention, and eventually you try and evaluate whether the training needs were satisfied. So this should really be drawn as a complete cycle, an iterative cycle, where if you didn't get it right the first time, you go back again and see if you can get it right in future. Now, what we normally do in practice is look for skills or knowledge gaps. So for example, if you decide in your organisation that everybody needs to know how to use Excel spreadsheets, then those who don't know how to do this have a training need in this area. And maybe a very simple way of designing a solution would be to say, let us produce a dummy spreadsheet that includes things like values, formulae, etc. And we will say if the trainees know how to produce this after the training, we will say that they've been trained to a sufficient standard. Then comes the delivery part. This can be done in any way you choose. Either send people on a course, it could be self-taught tutorials. What really matters to us though is the evaluation. Are they able to produce the spreadsheet at the end of the day? Now, another way to look at this basic gap analysis is to start not from a skills or knowledge gap, but from a business gap. So for example, let us say somebody works in manufacturing and some of the parts that they're producing need reworking. If the rework rate, say, was 10%, that's 1 in every 10 parts has to be modified in some way. Then we can ask the question, if this is a business problem, a business gap, are there any training needs that might help us to solve that business gap? So in effect, the business gap analysis is simultaneously a training needs analysis, although of course training will not always be part of the solution to a business problem. But once you've identified what the business gap is, the next question in terms of design is, well, who does most of the rework? This is a performance question. So going down this route, there will always be a connection between training needs analysis, performance and design of training solution. When it comes to actually delivering a solution, we could choose to bring in one of the best managers who knows about how to solve rework problems and maybe ask them to coach others in what's causing their rework problems and help them to resolve them. But again, the delivery mechanism is not the most important part of this cycle. The most important part is checking that the rework problem has actually been improved in some way. One of the final comment here is that when it comes to delivery, whichever method you choose, an evaluation specialist will normally recommend that you use action-centered learning. That is, you keep the learning as close to the source of the problem as possible. Hopefully now you'll see that evaluation fits in this total cycle but actually plays an incredibly important part. So, if you were classically trained and you knew about skills and knowledge gaps, and now you realise there's such a thing as a business gap that should instigate some learning, it really puts you in a very, very different position. You're going to have to become much closer to the business. Your relationship with line management is going to change. You are as accountable and as responsible for improving the way people and the business performs as they are. So training development is not just a bolt-on, it becomes integral to the way managers manage. And the data you'll be using will be the day-to-day data that managers use anyway. This is why evaluation in practice, when it's done properly from a baseline of measurement, is not that difficult to do, because you don't have to dream up measures. The measures are already there and they are already being collected. On very rare occasions will you have to go and set up a data collection system for this sort of business gap type evaluation. So one question that might go through your mind is, if we want to move to this sort of approach, what do I have to do with individual employees and line managers and senior management as well? Well, we've already talked about having a system in place, and that system has to be based on a very robust model for evaluation. So you cannot have a system until you get everybody following the same model. That's why we're going to look at something called the baseline model of evaluation. This is the baseline evaluation model that underpins every other part of this module. You're probably used to something called the 4-level model, which was developed by Donald Kirkpatrick many, many years ago. And that starts with level 1, which I call validation. And validation, all it does really is check reactions to whatever training intervention has happened. Most people call these happy sheets or smile sheets, and they don't really tell you much more than that. If we move up a step to level 2, level 2 is really the testing level. You're trying to establish what the trainees actually learned. So this is normally a knowledge test, although it can be a skills test as well. Things really start to get more important though when you get to level 3, because at level 3 the question you're asking is the learning being applied at work? This is why it's normally called the transfer or the behavioural level, because it means that the trainees have to actually show not only they've learned something, but they know how to apply it in the workplace. And level 4, the ultimate level under Kirkpatrick's model, asks what impact the training has had. Now on this version, the baseline model, we use slightly different terminology. We talk about value. Did the training add any value? And that value has to be expressed with a dollar or a pound sign. It has to be hard currency. And it's at level 4 that if you want to do return on investment, now is the time to do it. You don't need to wait for another level to do your return on investment calculation. One thing you might notice straight away is that level 4 is the most important level, but actually it's the most difficult to do. It's difficult to do particularly if you've not actually put a peg in the ground and said, well, where are we now? How much money, how much income, how much sales are we generating now before we start the training? And this is the key to the baseline model. We need a very, very clear set of questions before any training, development or learning intervention is designed. And these two questions are, do we have performance measures for the people we're thinking of training? And if we improve their performance, let us say by 1%, how much value will that add in dollars or pounds? Now you might think this is virtually exactly the same as Kirkpatrick's model, but actually all of the emphasis here is on the baseline. In fact, I'd go even so far to say that very rarely do I get involved in a lot of level 1, 2 and 3 validation, because the baseline questions should establish who is doing the evaluation, and that will usually be the trainee themselves or their line manager. So the training department has to do very little in the way of validation. And often I don't go as far as level 4, because you have this question of how do you know it was the training that made the difference? Now if you're trying to answer that question, you need to go to level 4, but in practice what you will find is good baseline questions will make sure that everything you do under the heading of learning will be very, very focused on business improvement. And that's really the part that evaluation should play. It makes a direct connection between learning and business performance and improvement. Now, it might not be readily apparent to you that the model you've just looked at is really very different to what you've used in the past. Certainly the 4 levels are still there. But I can't stress enough that the issue is not the 4 levels, it's the baseline. If you don't take a baseline, then forget evaluation. You've got nothing to compare the after with. Getting the before data right is absolutely crucial in learning. Now let's just try this with something like leadership development, something that you might think is very, very difficult to measure. But you have a choice, don't you? You can send people on a leadership development program where they don't have to be committed, they're not accountable for anything, they're not responsible for anything, they're not going to be measured against anything. And ask yourself the question, what are people likely to get out of a program like that? Well, they might get a lot. They might learn things that they never realised they should know. Okay, that's one reason for doing things like leadership development programs. But the key to evaluation, the key to learning is how do you apply it? Now, somebody going on a leadership program, if they are asked, how are you performing now in terms of your leadership ability? That's quite a tough question to answer, and some people might not want to answer it. But if they don't want to answer it now, why are they going to ever answer it after the event? When are they ever going to make the connection between what they're trying to learn about leadership and how they're going to actually apply it? And also, if you say to them, what would a 1% improvement in your leadership capability actually look like in terms of business performance? Then, if they don't want to answer that question, why are they there at all? So these baseline questions really hook people into the learning process, or they show people that they're not actually very committed to it at all. And again, you have a choice. Do you want to try and teach people something who aren't committed to learning? Or do you want to work with a group of people who say, I'll give this a go. I'm really interested in this because this looks like it might actually add some value. And I might actually be able to see how I'm performing better than I was before I went on the leadership program. So, give the baseline a go on any type of training, development or learning intervention. And the first thing you'll find out is it will sort the people who are less committed to learning and those who are really committed to it. Now, having established that the baseline is the most important step in evaluation, for those of you who still feel that they need to do happy sheets and tests, let's just say a few words about those. Happy sheets are okay as far as they go. Certainly if you get poor results on happy sheets or smile sheets, don't expect people to have learnt very much. But then, just because people are happy doesn't guarantee A, they've learnt anything, or B, they're going to apply what they've learnt. So as long as we treat them for what they're worth, happy sheets, okay, they may play a part. Level 2 testing is quite a tough level because you're actually saying to people, we're going to set a standard here, and if you don't reach that standard, we have to make a decision about whether you can continue to do the job you're doing. So be very careful how you introduce testing. But the next couple of slides just bring a few insights and a few practical ideas about how to go about testing and how you can use it in the whole of the learning process. In theory, all training and development should be tested to check that the trainees actually retain some knowledge or improve their skills. But in fact, in practice, doing testing is highly contentious because as soon as you say you're going to test somebody, you need to set a standard and you need to say what is the minimum standard they have to reach. So often I advise being very careful and very cautious about saying you're going to test people all the time. But in theory, you should do it all the time. So let's just quickly look at what else we can do with level 2 tests. The first thing here in this diagram is that we asked a group of people going on a workshop 15 questions, which are the numbers on the x-axis. And then, depending on their answers, we looked at the scores for the whole group. Now this very simple chart tells us that most people in the group knew the answer to question 9 and very few knew the answer to question 15. Now if you give out pre-training tests, one thing it helps you to do is refine the design of the training program. So here, for example, there would be more emphasis put on the subject content of question 15 to make sure people really understood it. We know level 2 testing is very important, But you should never forget that if you're going to give a test, you should have pre-test and post-test scores. Kirkpatrick tells us this in his level 2. So here we have a chart showing a before and after set of test scores. This is on a program where there was a group of trainees, all in training and development, who wanted to learn about evaluation. And you can see that there's a range of scores for people's knowledge of evaluation before they came on the workshop, and how these have improved since they went on the workshop. Of course, there are other questions this might pose. One would be, do you run a program for this group as a whole, or do you look at the group at the bottom end of this scale as a separate group and the ones at the top as maybe a more advanced group? So again, pre and post-test scores should be part of an ongoing design element of better training and development. Okay, so we've looked at happy sheets, we've looked at level 2 testing. So you might think, well, the next step is to move to level 3 and start to look at how we know that people are transferring their skills and knowledge to the workplace, the behavioural or the transfer level as it's called. But actually, let's take a step back again and say, well, let's not wait until the training or the learning event has happened before we ask this question. Let's ask this question at the beginning. Let's ask people before they go on any sort of learning event, how do you think you might apply some of the lessons we're trying to teach you on this programme? Now what that actually does is bring into sharp relief some of the real practical issues around transferring training to the workplace. For example, their supervisor or their line manager may not come on the programme. They may not even know what programme their people are on, or they may not know the detail. So what we really need to do is check out with these supervisors, these line managers, that what we're trying to teach people, they're going to let them apply that learning in their workplace. So we need to hook them into the whole process right from the beginning as well. So let's just take another look at this baseline before we go any further. The baseline model does look very much like Kirkpatrick's model, but actually it's meant to be a complete paradigm shift. It brings the whole emphasis in evaluation to before the training happens, to before any learning happens. Now that is quite a big shift for most people who work in training and development. Often we have pre-prepared solutions. We send managers on management development programs. We have competence frameworks, and we send people on competence modules. But actually the baseline evaluation model says that's putting the cart before the horse. The two questions that we need to ask is, are the target audience performing well before we train them? And having some clear performance measures, we will know who are the best and who are currently the worst in terms of performance. And we may design our training to suit 2 or 3 very different audiences. The second key question on the baseline is, how much value would a 1% improvement add in hard currency, whether it's dollars or pounds? Now, when you ask these questions both of sponsoring line managers and of the trainees themselves, it starts to put a lot more pressure on them. They can't just turn up on a training course thinking it's a few days out of the office or it's a chance to meet some of their colleagues who they don't see very often. This means that training and development has to be taken really seriously. So the baseline evaluation model is for serious professional trainers and developers. Now the really interesting thing is that if you get the baseline right at the beginning, if you go to a bit of trouble to ask these tough questions and to make sure you get some decent answers to them, you will very rarely have to do much in the way of levels 1 to 4. Because getting that focus right at the beginning, getting commitment at the beginning, getting responsibility for the evaluation in the hands of the trainees and the managers themselves means that very rarely will you be asked to do any post-training validation or evaluation. This is an incredibly simple point, but actually it represents a revolution in thinking in both training, development, learning and evaluation. By now you should see that the sort of training and development that we're really talking about here is what we call box 2 training, which is that which is designed specifically to add some value, to show an improvement in performance and to actually show an improvement on the bottom line with dollars, pounds or whatever hard currency you are using. Now that sort of training and development lends itself to considering return on investment, because all learning costs money, whether it's done informally or formally. It takes time, and it involves some form of investment. And all return on investment really tries to do is get that message across, that training and development is not a nice to have. It's not something that people can either take or leave. It is actually part of the way the organisation operates, for it to be professional, to be a high-performing organisation, and to constantly be looking for ways to innovate and to create value, to come up with ideas. All of this can be encapsulated in the basic concept of return on investment. If we spend some money on learning, what do we expect to get back for it? And the ROI formula just crystallises that discussion. So let's have a look at this formula and see what we can learn from it, and maybe how we can use it to our advantage. Now we're going to look at the formula for return on investment. The actual formula itself is incredibly simple and wasn't invented for training and development purposes. It's a standard formula for actually working out payback periods. If you're going to invest some money, when do you get your money back? So let's have a look at the formula in some detail. The basic formula looks at three things. It looks at gross benefits. So if you spend some money on training and development, let us say you do some sales training, the benefit would be the increase in sales as a result of the training. We look at the cost of that training, and we also then try and work out the net return on that original cost or that original investment. To produce the actual figure for the final calculation, we need to times everything by 100%. That will give us a percentage net return. Let us put some real figures in, and these are based on a large, well-known retailer who spent £1.4 million on a customer intimacy, customer satisfaction program. And without going into too much detail just here, we assume that there is a 1% improvement in profit on sales as a result of this customer satisfaction training program. Now, if we start to do the calculation, we take the gross benefit of £3.7 million increase in profit, and we deduct the original cost of the training of £1.4 million, and it leaves us with a net sum of £2.3 million. We now have to show that as a return on the original cost again of £1.4 million. This is the calculation. So the result is 164% return on investment in 1 year. In other words, if we spend £1.4 million on training employees in a year, and we get this much improvement in sales and profit in a year, then we can talk about the net return on investment of 164%. So having paid back the £1.4 million in effect to the business, we are still left with a net figure of £2.3 million in the bank, and that is 164% of the original investment of £1.4 million. If you're not very good at working out these sort of calculations, then I would strongly suggest you find a friendly colleague or friendly accountant who can do it for you. Better still, whenever you're having discussions using the baseline model about what training is required, ask some simple questions like what would a 1% improvement look like, and get them to put the figures into the calculation and the formula straight away. Immediately they will have to take this training and development more seriously, and they should be much more interested in seeing how it turns out at the end. Some people who work in the world of learning have a basic objection to the whole use of return on investment. They don't like to see a subject they probably regard as intangible and quite subjective in terms of hard pound or dollar signs. If you feel that way about ROI, then there are at least two other ways to view it where it can be used very successfully without actually measuring anything, and it should help you in convincing people of the importance of learning. The first way is just the basic concept of return on investment. This says there should be a common understanding that learning is as much an investment as anything else, and it should shift the focus from the cost of training and development to the benefits that come from it. Any banker, any accountant, any economist can understand that if you spend money on something, as long as you get a greater return than the cost, then it has been beneficial. And it's about time we started applying this simple concept to learning. This should win friends and influence people and actually support your case for more learning and raising the importance of learning in your organisation. Of course, the basic way to use it is to actually use the formula. Now, using the formula requires the use of business language. You have to have hard currency in the formula. This is not a formula for subjective evaluation. It has to have a monetary value. But if you're going to use the formula and you don't particularly like the formula, then use it very, very selectively. For example, if you're running a leadership program and you ask the question, what would a 1% improvement in the leadership cadre of the organisation be? It at least gets people to think about the benefit side of leadership development rather than just the cost. And leadership development can be quite expensive on paper. The third way is ROI as a management tool. Basically, every time you put together a learning program, you have a hypothesis that if person A learns something, that will help them to achieve their business objectives. ROI just makes that crystal clear. It aligns learning objectives with business objectives. And by doing so, it checks management commitment. So again, if you have a conversation and include return on investment with senior management, they will either very quickly dismiss ROI or they'll start to think more clearly about what learning really can do for the organisation. So don't dismiss ROI just as a formula. It can play a very, very important part in helping everybody in your organisation to take learning more seriously. This is the complete learning and performance cycle. And as a cycle, it starts and ends with measurement and evaluation. So what it says is that in practice, before you ever even mention the word training or development, you should always evaluate what the business needs are. This is looking for a gap in current business performance. For example, it could be that the organisation's costs are too high. And the words training, development, learning should not be mentioned at this phase in this cycle. It's only when you've got some measures of how high those costs are and how much they need to come down that you can move on to the next stage in this cycle. Now, rather than talk about training needs analysis, I think this is a more sophisticated approach. It is really a learning needs analysis that we have to do at this second stage. This is based on the measures that we've already established in the first step. And by learning needs, we're not just thinking of training courses. We could be thinking about all sorts of things, like, do people understand the process? Does anybody know where the system is breaking down? Everything that we can do to improve the performance of an organisation should in some way be able to be brought back to some learning needs. Once you've established what the learning needs are, then you can start to design a solution. If the process is too expensive and that's why costs are high, then we're going to design a learning solution to look at the process and try and do something about it. Once we've designed the solution, then we deliver the solution. These are the basic steps that we've learned from the classical training cycle. When you've delivered the learning solution, then you should validate that people have learned what they need to know. So you may give a level 2 test to some of the trainees to check that they understand how the process works and where it might be improved. Now, the really interesting part of this cycle is that even if somebody learns how to improve something, they might not be allowed to do that in the workplace. The people who are currently running that process, the senior managers who actually design that process, might say, well, we don't want any change to the process unless we give our permission. Now, if you start at the beginning knowing that you're going to have to reinforce learning, then what this cycle says is that you should identify who is going to reinforce learning before moving on from step 1. This is a very, very important part of the cycle. The reason it's so important is if you don't get reinforcement of learning by the people who really matter and the people who have the authority to make learning work, then you won't get the transfer from the learning solution, whether that's in the classroom or online, to the workplace. So without reinforcement, you don't get transfer, you don't get behavioural shift. But regardless of whether this first cycle has worked, you must feed back to those you spoke to at the beginning and say, has it lowered costs? Now, interestingly, if it has lowered costs, people should be able to say that it looks like the learning solution has helped. Maybe it will never say any more than that. This is not about proving that a learning intervention made all the difference on its own. But the really interesting thing is, what if costs haven't come down? Now we have to go back to begin and say, well, maybe that wasn't the real issue in the first place, or maybe we got the learning solution wrong. So this is always an iterative cycle, and it should go around and around and around, constantly trying to improve the performance of the organisation. And evaluation is an absolutely critical part of this cycle, both at the beginning and at the end. So hopefully by now you've seen where evaluation fits into the complete picture, how it has to be done systematically, how everybody involved, all the stakeholders, all the participants, have to go in with their eyes open and fully realise that they're working within a system here, a system for learning and improvement and performance. As with all the modules in the Consummate Professional series, there are some exercises for you to do, if you choose to. And one or two of them have model answers, but the others just take you through a series of steps to put some of the theory into practice in your own workplace and in your own context. So give them a try. They are relatively straightforward, but the idea is that you build up your confidence. So if you've never tried some of these ideas out before, try them out very gently. I would recommend that you try them out with line managers and willing participants who understand that you're learning as much as they are, and you're all in this together and actually are on your side and trying to make this work. I would not recommend taking anybody on board who doesn't really want to take part. They can be dealt with later on when they see some of the great results that come out of a proper evaluation and return on investment framework. I hope you've enjoyed this module. I think it will make a big difference to the way you work. It will aid your professionalism. It will aid the profile you have in your organisation. And I think you might find some senior managers taking a totally different view of what learning and development is really all about.